September 23, 1999. Mission Control waits for a signal from Mars. It never comes. Somewhere behind the red planet, a spacecraft that cost this program hundreds of millions of dollars is either settling into orbit or it is already gone, tumbling in pieces through thin atmosphere. No alarm went off. No warning light blinked red. No last transmission crackled through with a clue. Just the ordinary hiss of empty channels, where a signal should have been arriving right on schedule, exactly as it had 100 times before during the cruise out. By the end of this file, you'll understand how NASA, an agency that lands rovers within meters of a target 100 million miles away, lost an entire spacecraft over a mismatch most of us make on a bathroom scale without ever noticing. Not a computer bug in the traditional sense. Not a meteor strike. Not a solar flare. Not a structural failure. A single number, correctly calculated, correctly transmitted, correctly received, and quietly wearing the wrong label the entire time, unnoticed by anyone with the authority to stop it. Most people who've heard this story tell it the same simplified way. NASA engineers, they say, forgot to convert pounds to kilograms like a student botching a homework problem. A rounding error, sloppy math from the smartest room in the building, embarrassing and almost funny. It's a tidy story, easy to repeat at a dinner table. It fits what people already believe about big institutions making small, careless mistakes. It's also not quite what happened, and the real mechanism is far more unsettling than a forgotten conversion. Start with the spacecraft itself. Mars Climate Orbiter launched in December 1998, riding a Delta II rocket toward a planet it would take 9 months to reach. Its job was to study Martian weather patterns from orbit and act as a communications relay for a lander, Mars Polar Lander, following a few months behind it. To do that job, it needed to slip into orbit at a precise altitude above the surface. Too high, and it would miss its intended science targets entirely. Too low, and it would hit atmosphere it wasn't built to survive. That final altitude depended on months of small, deliberate course corrections performed throughout the cruise phase. Thrusters fired periodically in short, controlled bursts to nudge the spacecraft's trajectory back onto its intended path toward Mars. Each firing produced a tiny push, measured scientifically as impulse, force multiplied by time. Ground software tracked that impulse carefully and fed the resulting numbers into navigation models that predicted, days and weeks ahead, exactly where the spacecraft would be in space. The model's accuracy depended entirely on the accuracy of the numbers feeding it. Here's where the story gets specific instead of vague. One piece of ground software built by a contractor, Lockheed Martin, calculated thruster impulse in pound-force seconds the Imperial unit engineers there had used by habit. NASA's navigation team on the receiving end at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory expected that data in Newton seconds, the metric unit explicitly specified in the mission's own interface control documentation. The file's format said newtons. The numbers actually sitting inside it were pounds. Nothing in the file itself flagged the contradiction. 1 pound force equals about 4.45 newtons, a conversion factor any engineer could recite from memory. So every single time that software reported a thruster's push, the number reaching NASA's navigation models was roughly 4.45 times smaller than the force actually applied in reality. The mishap investigation later found this consistent mismatch produced an error of that same rough magnitude, compounding steadily in the spacecraft's calculated trajectory across the entire 9-month journey from Earth to Mars, a gap the models had no way of knowing existed. That's not a rounding error, the kind you'd catch by checking a decimal point. That's two pieces of software agreeing to disagree about what a number fundamentally meant for months on end, without a single person catching it in real time. And this kept happening, quietly, mechanically. Every trajectory correction during the 9-month cruise to Mars used this same skewed, undersized data as its foundation. Small errors, compounding invisibly, one course correction at a time, each one nudging the spacecraft further from where everyone believed it was. NASA's own navigation team did notice something was off, to their credit. Independent trajectory estimates, calculated separately using different tracking methods from the file in question, kept disagreeing with the mission's official numbers, sometimes by amounts that worried the engineers running them. Some engineers raised it internally, in emails and meetings. The discrepancy got discussed, debated, occasionally escalated, but without a clear, provable reason for the mismatch. The team lacked solid grounds to override the mission's official trajectory outright. The wrong number, backed by official process, kept winning the argument. By the time Mars Climate Orbiter finally reached the planet, it was on course to pass through the Martian atmosphere at an altitude far lower than anyone had planned or approved. NASA's Mishap Investigation Board later estimated the spacecraft's closest approach at somewhere around 57 kilometers above the surface, well inside the range where atmospheric drag and frictional heating would tear a spacecraft apart within seconds. The intended, carefully designed target had been roughly 150 kilometers, a difference that meant the spacecraft entered a completely different, unsurvivable environment. No single person mistyped a number on launch day, and no engineer sat down and carelessly used the wrong formula out of laziness. The actual mechanism is quieter and colder than that. Two separate teams, two pieces of software, two unit systems operating side by side, and one shared file format that never forced anyone to explicitly state which system was actually in use. The interface itself allowed a silent mismatch to pass through undetected. Nothing downstream in the entire pipeline was built to catch it. That's the deeper failure, the one worth sitting with. Not one wrong number typed by one tired person, but an entire system where a wrong number could travel from one competent team to another competent team, unquestioned and unverified, for the length of an entire interplanetary cruise spanning 9 months. The file passed every check that existed at the time. It simply didn't pass a check that nobody had thought to build yet, because nobody imagined this particular silence was possible. This is the part that makes the whole thing feel like fate instead of ordinary physics and process. Nobody who worked on Mars Climate Orbiter thinks of themselves as careless, and by every account, they weren't. Each person did their assigned job correctly, competently, using the units their own software had always been built around, following the standards of their own subteam. The failure didn't live inside either team's work. It lived entirely in the space between them, in an assumption neither side thought to voice out loud. That's why this reads, in hindsight, as bad luck instead of clear cause and effect. We remember the sudden, silent moment of loss, the missing signal on September 23rd. We don't see the months of quiet disagreement between two data sets that nobody had the authority or the hard evidence to resolve in time before it mattered. The story feels sudden, almost accidental. The chain that actually produced it was slow, procedural, and entirely traceable. If you're finding this case file useful, subscribe. There's a new one every week. Some details here are still argued over by engineers and historians revisiting the case. Reports variously describe the file as reporting pound seconds, where Newton seconds were expected, and different retellings phrase the specific software module involved and its exact operational role slightly differently depending on the source. The Mishap Board's public report remains the most complete official account available, but even NASA's own summary notes the broader review looked at general software verification practices across the mission, not solely at this one isolated file. What is settled, beyond dispute, is the outcome. A spacecraft built for years of sustained scientific study around Mars instead made exactly one uncontrolled, fatal pass through its thin atmosphere and was lost completely, its mission over before it truly began. The Mishap Board's report became required reading for engineers on nearly every NASA mission that followed it, not simply retold as a cautionary story about a single mistake, but studied as a precise description of exactly the kind of interface gap a checklist now exists to close. Murphy's Law isn't really a complaint that things go wrong eventually, given enough time. It's an instruction to design systems as if they will go wrong, deliberately, before launch, before the silence arrives. This file, this one quiet unit mismatch, is a large part of the reason that instruction still holds real weight inside engineering rooms today. Next file on the board, a toaster, a cue, and the sensor nobody thought could possibly be installed backwards.